There is a theater in Washington. A warm April night. The crowd laughs. The war is almost over. And then a single gunshot tears through the air, and the course of history bends forever. But to understand that moment, to truly understand what was lost in that box at Ford's Theater on the night of April 14th, 1865, we must go back, far back, to a log cabin on the Kentucky frontier, to a boy with no shoes, no schooling, and no future anyone could have predicted. This is the story of Abraham Lincoln, the 16th President of the United States, the man who held a fractured nation together while it consumed itself in the deadliest war Americans had ever known. A man shaped by poverty, loss, and an almost supernatural capacity for endurance. How did a child born in a one-room cabin to parents who could not read or write become the leader who ended slavery in a nation built in part upon it? And why, at the very moment his greatest work seemed finished, was he taken from the world? The answers lie in a life unlike any other in the American story. February 12, 1809, Hardin County, Kentucky. The Ohio River Valley in winter is a severe, unforgiving place. Dense forests of oak and elm stretch to the horizon. The ground, when not frozen solid, turns to heavy red mud. Wolves howl at the edges of settlements. And in a windowless, dirt-floor cabin with a single fireplace, a woman named Nancy Hanks Lincoln gives birth to her second child. They name him Abraham. Thomas Lincoln, the boy's father, is a carpenter and subsistence farmer. He is neither cruel nor particularly ambitious. He works hard and moves often, from Kentucky to Indiana to Illinois, always chasing slightly better land, slightly less debt. The Lincoln family is among the poorest of the frontier poor. Young Abraham grew tall fast, unusually tall. By adolescence, he would stand 6 feet 4 inches, with long, powerful arms and enormous hands. Those hands split rail fences from sunup to sundown. They drove axes into frozen wood. They hauled flatboats down the Mississippi River. It is back-breaking work that leaves the kind of scars a man carries his whole life. But there is something else about this boy, something that sets him apart from every other child on that frontier. He is consumed, almost desperately, by books. In a world where most children had no schooling whatsoever, Abraham Lincoln attended school intermittently for a grand total of about 12 months across his entire childhood. His teachers were barely educated themselves, yet Lincoln read everything he could find: the Bible, Aesop's Fables, Robinson Crusoe, the works of Shakespeare. He would walk miles to borrow a single volume. He read by firelight when candles were too expensive. He copied passages onto a wooden shovel with charcoal when he had no paper. A childhood friend later recalled seeing Lincoln red-eyed and tousled-haired, late at night, poring over a book with a kind of manic intensity. Lincoln himself would later say that reading was the only education he had, and that it was enough. When Abraham was 9 years old, his mother, Nancy, died. Milk sickness, a poisoning passed through cows who had eaten a toxic plant. It was a common killer on the frontier, quiet and terrible. Nancy Hanks Lincoln was 34 years old. Abraham helped his father build her coffin. The boy who had already known poverty and physical hardship now knew grief, profound, wordless grief. This early loss would mark him for the rest of his life. Those who knew Lincoln as an adult spoke often of a sadness in him, a melancholy that lived just beneath the surface of his humor and warmth. He struggled with what later generations would recognize as depression. He called it simply the hypo. Thomas Lincoln eventually remarried, a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston, who came with her own children and a fierce determination to bring order and warmth to the Lincoln household. Abraham and his new stepmother developed a bond of genuine affection. She recognized his intelligence immediately, encouraged his reading, and later said of him that he was the best boy she ever saw. But the frontier had little patience for dreamers. As a young man, Lincoln worked as a flatboat navigator, a store clerk, a postmaster, a surveyor, and a soldier in the brief Black Hawk War of 1832, a conflict he later joked he had survived without seeing any actual combat, unless you count the battles against mosquitoes. It was in the small town of New Salem, Illinois, that Lincoln's life began to take shape. He arrived there at 21 with almost nothing. He co-owned a general store that failed. He ran for the state legislature and lost his first election. He lost a second time. He fell into what appeared to be a serious depressive episode. He was, by every conventional measure, a young man without prospects. And yet, something remarkable was happening beneath the surface. Lincoln was reading law books, teaching himself alone, with borrowed volumes and sheer determination. He passed the bar in 1836 without ever having attended a law school. Within years, he would become one of the most successful lawyers in Illinois, known for his precision, his storytelling, and his ability to make even hostile juries laugh. He entered politics as a member of the Illinois State Legislature, serving 4 terms. He moved to Springfield. He married Mary Todd in 1842, a union that was passionate, complicated, and never easy, but one that produced 4 sons and endured the pressures of a life in public service. Lincoln ran for the United States Senate in 1858 against Democrat Stephen Douglas. He lost that race too, but the 7 debates he and Douglas held across Illinois in front of crowds of thousands made Lincoln's name known across the entire nation. It was in those debates that Lincoln sharpened the argument that would define his political life, that a nation could not survive permanently half slave and half free, that the moral contradiction at the heart of American democracy would eventually demand resolution. A house divided against itself, Lincoln said, cannot stand. Few people paid enough attention to understand just how prophetic those words were. In May of 1860, the Republican Party nominated Abraham Lincoln as their candidate for the presidency of the United States. It was a surprising choice. Lincoln had served only a single, undistinguished term in the House of Representatives. His rivals, men like William Seward of New York, were more experienced, more powerful, more connected. But Lincoln was something they were not. He was the candidate who could win the North without losing the moderate center. He was the self-made man, the rail splitter, the backwoods lawyer who had risen entirely on the strength of his own mind. In a nation where the myth of self-made success was already deeply embedded in the national imagination, Abraham Lincoln was that myth made flesh. He won the presidency in November 1860 without carrying a single Southern state, not one. His name had not even appeared on ballots across much of the South. The reaction was immediate and violent. By the time Lincoln was inaugurated in March of 1861, 7 Southern states had already seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America, electing Jefferson Davis as their president. 4 more would follow. The United States, a nation less than a century old, was tearing itself in 2. Lincoln's first inaugural address was an appeal, almost a plea, to the South. He had no intention of abolishing slavery where it already existed, he promised. He only opposed its expansion. The Union must and would be preserved, and if war came, it would be the South that fired first. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces opened fire on Fort Sumter, South Carolina. The Civil War had begun. What followed was 4 years of carnage on a scale Americans had never imagined possible. Over 600,000 soldiers would die, more Americans than in all other wars the nation had fought before or since combined. Entire landscapes were turned into killing fields, towns were burned, families were split, a generation of young men was consumed. Lincoln had no military training. His Confederate counterpart, Jefferson Davis, was a West Point graduate and a hero of the Mexican War. And yet it was Lincoln who would prove over 4 terrible years to be a military strategist of genuine insight, patient when patience was required, aggressive when aggression was necessary, and always relentlessly focused on the single goal of preserving the Union. He slept on a cot in the telegraph office during major battles. He called the new technology lightning messages. He read dispatches from the front at all hours and made decisions that generals twice his experience would have hesitated to make. He fired commanders who would not fight. He promoted men like Ulysses Grant, rough, unglamorous, relentless, when the military establishment looked down on them. Inside the White House, Lincoln's life was shadowed by personal grief that might have broken a lesser man. In 1862, his son Willie, just 11 years old, died of typhoid fever in the White House. Mary Todd Lincoln was inconsolable. Lincoln wept in private, and then he returned to his desk. His cabinet was, famously, a team of rivals. Lincoln had deliberately appointed men who disagreed with him, who competed against him, who privately thought they were smarter than he was. Seward, Chase, Stanton, brilliant, ambitious, difficult men. Lincoln managed them all with a patience and political intelligence that left even his opponents eventually convinced of his greatness. In September 1862, following the bloody and inconclusive Battle of Antietam, Lincoln made the decision that would define his legacy. He issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. It took effect on January 1, 1863. It declared that all enslaved people in the rebellious Confederate States were, from that moment, free. The proclamation was a complex document. It did not immediately free all enslaved people, and it applied only to states in open rebellion. Critics then and now have noted its limitations, but its moral and strategic significance was enormous. It reframed the war. The Union was no longer fighting merely to preserve its territory. It was now fighting explicitly for the principle that all men are created equal. It made any possibility of European recognition of the Confederacy politically impossible, and it pointed the direction toward the 13th Amendment, which would abolish slavery everywhere in the United States once the war was won. On November 19, 1863, Lincoln stood at the dedication of a military cemetery at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a field where 50,000 men had fallen just 4 months earlier in 3 days of fighting that had turned the tide of the war. He was not the main speaker that day. A famous orator named Edward Everett had delivered a 2-hour address. Lincoln spoke for less than 3 minutes. But his 272 words would outlast anything else spoken that day, or perhaps spoken in any political context in American history. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. He spoke of the unfinished work before them. He spoke of a new birth of freedom. He spoke of government of the people, by the people, for the people. The crowd applauded politely. Some newspapers dismissed the address. Lincoln himself thought it had fallen flat. He could not have known that he had just written what future generations would recognize as perhaps the finest short speech in the English language. By the election of 1864, Lincoln feared he would lose. The war had dragged on for 3 years. The casualties were staggering. public morale was collapsing. Even within his own party, there were men who wanted to replace him. He signed a memorandum privately noting that it appeared probable he would not be re-elected. Then, General Sherman took Atlanta, and Grant's relentless pressure in Virginia began to break the Confederate Army. The tide turned in the final weeks of the campaign, and Lincoln won re-election with 55% of the popular vote. His second inaugural address, delivered on March 4, 1865, was unlike any victory speech in American history. It contained no triumphalism, no gloating. It spoke of the war as a shared national tragedy, a divine punishment, perhaps, for the sin of slavery that both North and South had permitted for generations. It ended with words of almost unbearable generosity, with malice to none, with charity for all. Lincoln knew the war was almost over. He could see it. He had earned the right to celebrate. Instead, he spoke of healing. Now, before we reach the final chapter, we want to hear from you. What do you think of Lincoln's journey so far? Was he the greatest American president, or simply a man of extraordinary circumstances? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective matters here, and we read every single one. April 9, 1865, Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. General Robert E. Lee, commander of the Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, surrendered to General Ulysses S. Grant. The Civil War was over. Washington erupted in celebration. Cannons fired, crowds gathered in the streets, bands played. People wept with relief. 4 years of the most devastating conflict in American history had finally ended. The Union had survived. Slavery was abolished. Lincoln had done what almost no one had believed possible when he entered office 4 years earlier. He was 56 years old. Photographs from those final months show a man who looks 20 years older than he did at his first inauguration. The weight of 4 years of war, of 600,000 dead, of impossible decisions made at midnight, of grief personal and national, had carved itself into his face. His cheeks were hollow. His eyes carried something that those who saw him in person described as an almost oceanic sadness. But he was also, in those final days, in a mood of genuine relief and even joy. He had dreamed just days before of a ship sailing rapidly toward a dark and indefinite shore, a dream he said always came to him before great events. He told his cabinet about it on the morning of April 14th. He seemed almost light. The terrible weight was lifting. That evening, Lincoln and his wife, Mary Todd, had been invited to attend a performance of the comedy Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater. Lincoln did not particularly want to go. He was tired, but the newspapers had announced his attendance, and he felt he could not disappoint the public. John Wilkes Booth read those same newspapers. Booth was 36 years old, a handsome, celebrated actor from a famous theatrical family. His brother Edwin was considered the greatest Shakespearean actor of his generation. John had grown up on a Maryland plantation. He was a passionate Confederate sympathizer who had never served in the Confederate Army, but burned with hatred for Abraham Lincoln. Originally, Booth had conceived a plot to kidnap Lincoln, to take him hostage and force the Union to exchange Confederate prisoners of war. That plan had collapsed. Now, with the Confederacy defeated and Lincoln talking publicly about voting rights for black soldiers, Booth had decided on something far more drastic. He did not act alone. His conspiracy included Lewis Powell, assigned to kill Secretary of State William Seward, George Atzerodt, assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, David Harold, who would guide Powell to Seward's home. The plan was simultaneous assassination, a decapitation of the entire United States government in a single night. Booth knew Ford's Theater intimately. He had performed there. He knew every entrance, every corridor, every shadow. During the afternoon of April 14th, he walked through the theater, examined the presidential box, and prepared his approach with the careful precision of a man who understood stagecraft. At 10:15 in the evening, while the audience laughed at the comedy below, and Lincoln sat in his chair in the private box above the stage, Booth slipped through the door, which had been poorly secured, the president's bodyguard having temporarily left his post, and walked up behind Abraham Lincoln. He pressed a small .44 caliber Derringer pistol against the back of Lincoln's head, just behind the left ear, and pulled the trigger. Lincoln slumped forward. Mary Todd screamed. Major Henry Rathbone, a young Army officer seated in the box, lunged at Booth, who stabbed him in the arm. Booth leapt from the box onto the stage, catching his boot spur on the decorative bunting as he fell, breaking his left leg. He rose, shouted the Virginia state motto, Sic semper tyrannis, thus ever to tyrants, and ran. The theater erupted in chaos. Women fainted, men shouted. Doctors in the audience rushed to the presidential box. A young Army surgeon named Charles Lale, just 23 years old, was the first physician to reach Lincoln. He found the president unresponsive, his pulse almost undetectable. Lale removed a clot of blood and tissue from the wound and briefly restored the pulse, but he knew immediately, with the clinical clarity of a doctor who had spent years treating battlefield wounds, that Abraham Lincoln would not survive. They carried the president across the street to the Peterson House, a boarding house whose owner had watched the terrible procession from his doorway. Lincoln was laid diagonally across a bed that was too small for his 6'4" frame. Doctors came and went through the night. Mary Todd wept in an adjoining room. Cabinet members arrived, pale and stricken. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton stood in the small room and directed the response to what appeared to be a coordinated attack on the government. Meanwhile, across Washington, the other elements of Booth's conspiracy were unfolding with mixed results. Lewis Powell forced his way into Secretary of State Seward's home and attacked him with a knife, slashing his face and neck severely. Seward survived, disfigured for life. George Atzerodt, assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson, lost his nerve entirely and spent the night drinking in a hotel bar without attempting the assassination. Back at the Peterson House, Lincoln lingered through the night. His breathing was labored. His pulse grew slower. At 7:22 in the morning of April 15, 1865, Abraham Lincoln died. Edwin Stanton, the hard, brilliant, difficult Secretary of War who had clashed with Lincoln countless times and come to admire him with something approaching reverence, stood in the room and spoke the words that would be remembered forever after. "He belongs to the ages," Stanton said. John Wilkes Booth was hunted through Virginia for 12 days. He was finally cornered in a barn near Bowling Green on April 26th. He refused to surrender. The barn was set on fire. A Union soldier shot Booth through a gap in the barn boards, hitting him in the neck. He was dragged outside and died 3 hours later. 4 of Booth's co-conspirators were convicted by military tribunal and hanged on July 7, 1865, including Mary Surratt, the first woman ever executed by the United States federal government. Others received prison sentences. Lincoln's body was dressed, wrapped in a flag, and placed in a coffin. It lay in state in the Capitol Rotunda. and then it was placed on a train. That train traveled from Washington through Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York, Albany, Cleveland, Columbus, Indianapolis, and Chicago before reaching Lincoln's hometown of Springfield, Illinois. Tens of thousands of Americans lined the railroad tracks at every hour of the day and night, in rain and cold, to watch the train pass. Many had walked miles to be there. Many wept openly. Many had never seen Abraham Lincoln in life, but they came. He was buried at Oak Ridge Cemetery in Springfield on May 4, 1865. Beside him lay his son, Willie, who had died in the White House 2 years before. Mary Todd Lincoln was so devastated that she was unable to attend the funeral. The nation Lincoln had saved did not, in the end, fully achieve what he had sacrificed everything for. The years of Reconstruction that followed his death were marked by violence, broken promises, and the systematic dismantling of the rights of freed Black Americans. It would take another century and another generation of martyrs before the promise of Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation began to be more fully honored. Some historians argue that Lincoln's death was, in a way, the final casualty of the Civil War, that with him died the best chance for a reconstruction guided by his extraordinary combination of moral clarity and political generosity. With malice to none, with charity for all. Without Lincoln, malice won. Others argue that Lincoln the myth has obscured Lincoln the man, that he was a complicated, calculating politician who moved slowly on the question of slavery and whose views on race were, by any modern standard, deeply imperfect. Both things are true. He was a man of his time who exceeded his time. He was a politician who became, through the pressure of events, something closer to a prophet. What is not in... There are few stories in the human record quite like this one. A life that begins in the mud of the frontier and ends in the blood of Ford's Theater, and in between somehow reshapes the destiny of a nation and leaves behind words that the world will never stop reading. Abraham Lincoln does not belong only to Americans. He belongs to anyone who has ever been told that where they come from makes who they can become. He belongs to anyone who has carried loss and kept going. He belongs to the ages. We have reached the end of this documentary, and we want to say something directly to you, who stayed with us through every chapter of this remarkable story. Your time and your attention mean everything to us. We know you could have been anywhere else, and you chose to be here, listening to a story that deserves to be remembered. Thank you. Deeply, truly, thank you. And we promise you this, the best is still to come. What you have seen in this documentary is only the beginning of the historical journeys we have prepared for you. There are empires, conspiracies, betrayals, and lives even more extraordinary waiting in the episodes ahead. Do not miss them. If this story moved you, if it made you think, if it made you feel something, please subscribe to this channel so you never miss what comes next. And leave us a comment. In your view, was Abraham Lincoln the greatest American president or the most tragic figure the United States ever produced? We want to know what you think. And now, do not stop. The next story is already waiting for you.